Welcome to another episode of Vendée Radio. Today it is a very great honour to be joined by Julia Meloni, who writes for Crisis magazine and 1 Peter 5. She writes from the Pacific Northwest and she holds a bachelor's degree in English from Yale and a master's degree in English from Harvard. And what drew my attention to Julia's work is a number of articles she's written for Crisis magazine, including The Man Who Was Anti-Pope, the St Gallen Mafia's LGBT Youth Synod, then Haunted by McCarrick, and France's allies reveal their plan for revolutionary change more recently. And these articles struck me as particularly engaging and erudite, with particularly penetrating analysis of current events in the Church, particularly on this idea that has bewildered many faithful across the world, which is synodality. And Julia has written very cogently about how synodality, permanent synodality, is a revolutionary dialectic that is employed by modernists within the Church, really beginning with this person, Cardinal Martini. And that would be my first question to you, Julia. Can you talk a little bit about the character and person of Cardinal Martini, this man who called himself the anti-pope, and that is anti-A-N-T-E as opposed to A-N-T-I, so antecedent pope, how he seems now to reach beyond the grave to influence decisions in the Church and the agenda that we see going forward?
Reception. He attacked Humanae Vitae very publicly. He had radical positions on same-sex unions. He endorsed them. He also at one point called legal abortion positive. Mm-hmm. This is the sort of person who was leading the St Gallen Mafia. And in 1999, he really laid bare where he wanted the Church to go, and gave us a blueprint for the revolution. And it was a speech that he gave at the Synod of Bishops in 1999. And he said that he had a dream for the Church. And he said that he wanted to get the Church in a permanent synodal state. And there's a great article that Edward Penton did that explored what this mysterious word synodality means. And one of the most insightful points that this article gave is that synodality seems to be synonymous with permanent revolution. So Martini wanted to get the Church in a state of revolution with the synods, and he outlined specific knots that he wanted the Church to address. And the knots were marriage, sexuality, penitential practice, the need to revive ecumenical hopes, the shortage of ordained ministers, the role of women in the Church, and the relationship between civil law and moral law. And if you think about the synods that we've had so far, the family synods and the youth synod, the beginning of this blueprint maps onto it perfectly, because communion for the divorced and remarried was the main agenda at the family synods. And they tried to get the issue of homosexual couples in there. It didn't quite take. And that's something that I anticipate the youth synods post-synodal exhortation to really address. And it really, when you think about the other things that Martini names, one of them is the shortage of ordained ministers, and that is something that the Amazon Synod is going to be addressing, ordaining married men later this year. And I think for me the most ominous part of all of this is the end game. So what does the St Gallen Mafia want? Where do they want the Church to finally go? And I think the key to it is this idea of the relationship between civil law and moral law. That was the last knot that they described. And the relationship between civil law and moral laws, you just look at what the members of the St Gallen Mafia stood for. And I already mentioned Martini said legal abortion was positive. Another member, Cardinal Kasper, according to testimony, he actually told a king to sign an abortion bill in 1999. We also have Daniels and Cardinal Kasper, both on record hailing same-sex marriage laws. So this is the end game. It's something that the late Cardinal Kasper described in one of his last speeches before his death. He described the plot to create a kind of anti-creation that was pillared on these principles. And I think that's exactly what the St Gallen Mafia stands for and what the final goal is.
Are you familiar with the Marxist theory of praxis?
Yeah, yes, to an extent that I, as an English major, have some basics of the philosophy.
Right.
Yes, I'm familiar with it.
Yeah, well, I mean, you probably know then that Marx said the philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it. In other words, it doesn't matter what this ethereal magisterium thinks or promulgates. In some dusty chamber. What matters is the pastoral application and interpretation of that by the vast majority of the laity. So, how is that pastoral method important to the St Gallen Mafia? Because of course they can't actually change church teaching, guarded as it is by the Holy Spirit. But nevertheless, they can change people's perception of that teaching.
Yeah, I think your comment is really insightful. That's a major point that the historian Roberto de Mattei often makes, which is that what matters is what you do, praxis, changing the world, exactly as you put it. And the idea of praxis and the pastoral implications of church teaching, that was something that the Mafia definitely stressed. I'm thinking in particular of Cardinal Murphy O'Connor. He was good friends with then Cardinal Bergoglio. And Murphy O'Connor, in his memoirs called An English Spring, he said that he greatly admired Martini, but he thought of himself as a cautious reformer. And so Murphy O'Connor said that what mattered was changing things incrementally and having a sort of gently leashed revolution. Mm-hmm. And I think his stance on Humanae Vitae is really illuminating, because Murphy O'Connor, when it came out, he explains in his memoirs that their struggle was to affirm church teaching, affirm the doctrine, the position of Rome, but also find a way to make it pastorally sensitive. And I think that's code for allowing people in practice to find certain situations that allegedly give them an exception to this moral norm. And that was part of the incremental steps, because it's too audacious to come right out and try to change the doctrine. And what matters at the end of the day is what Murphy O'Connor said was doctrine changes indirectly. Mm-hmm. In an indirect way. And I think right there he was conceding that all of these changes to praxis, they are having doctrinal implications. Of course, we know that the doctrine that the church holds is not going to change, but we do know that in practice it's going to feel weaker because of the changes in praxis. So yes, that is a major theme in the revolution.
And you mentioned Murphy O'Connor, who's now deceased, but his press secretary, Austin Ivory, is a really vocal member of what's been called Team Francis. And I'm interested to what extent Team Francis have a route into the Francis papacy itself, how the Francis papacy uses these external figures to deal with dissent to the agenda. I mean, it seems that Antonio Spadaro, for example, is a key sort of nexus figure who gives these external figures their kind of brief on the messaging.
Yeah, I think that definitely Father Spadaro and Austin Ivory and some other names have emerged as very important in the messaging of this pontificate. I was researching some stuff on the Youth Synod today, and I ran across one of Father Spadaro's old tweets, and he talks about the church. He accuses critics of Francis of being rigid and mummified, wanting a mummified museum church, and he has this little figure of a mummy on his tweet. But that sort of messaging, definitely it's helpful insofar as it lays bare in a more concrete language where we're going, what the papacy wants. Father Spadaro, he's been called an oracle, so to speak, by Sandro Magister, a very, very prominent Vaticanist. And I remember when I was researching the Youth Synod, I remember reading some of the statements that Father Spadaro had made, and they did seem very prophetic about where the church was going, trying to get away from ready-made answers on different topics, trying to increase the role of conscience in the praxis of the church. And definitely Austin Ivory, I highly recommend his book, The Great Reformer, because it is an inside look at the St Gallen Mafia and this papacy from someone who, as you said, was the former press secretary for Murphy O'Connor. And he gives details like sitting with Murphy O'Connor over gin and tonic and hearing hints about Bergoglio in the 2005 conclave. So these are crucial details that we get about not just where the papacy is going, but what happened in the past and how we can try to piece together some of what happened with the mafia.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you mentioned his book because he's working on a sequel, I believe, for the last few years of Francis' pontificate, which where division and dissent has really exploded. Considering things like the homosexual abuse crisis, the China deal, the Vigano letter. It'll be interesting to read how he spins that, because you're right. The modernists don't want to push things too far too fast, so that sort of naive mainstream Catholics are tempted towards, so that a schism or something like that happens. They want to maintain this illusion of a hermeneutic of continuity. And you mentioned the Youth Synod last year. Now, the commentariat had said that the St Gallen agenda there was to effectively normalise homosexual relations. And by all accounts, that agenda was thwarted. Could you give a little account of how that happened? I mean, was it just the case that bishops were more wise to the methods used by this group from the family synods of 14 and 15?
Yeah, I think that definitely a big lesson was learned on all sides after the infamous Family Synod interim report in 2014. that talked about the precious support that you could find in same-sex relationships. They dropped that report the very day that 2 Italian political parties backed homosexual unions, and they were forced in the press conference to disclose basically who wrote those paragraphs, and it was Archbishop Bruno Forte, who is a leading disciple of Martini. So they tried to overplay their hand in that first synod. They revealed what the final outcome is supposed to be. They revealed that communion for the divorced and remarried is just this Trojan horse for the issue of homosexual couples. Now, definitely the next synod, Cardinal Kasper, also of the St Gallen Mafia, he said that he tried to push the issue of homosexuality and it didn't take. And he told Frederick Martel, the author of a controversial new book on homosexuality in the Vatican, but Martel reports that Kasper said that Pope Francis has a small step strategy, and it's the right strategy, and Francis has been pushing the debate on homosexuality further. So the Youth Synod, I think, as a young person myself, I think that it was an attempt to use young people, to manipulate and exploit young people, to try to change teaching on this issue. And we have a book by Martini himself called Night Conversations, and the entire premise of the book is that it's answering questions from young people. And Martini, he paints, this picture of young people as these revolutionaries, these prophets who are leftists and want to change the church's teaching on sexuality, all of this. And if you look at the documents of the Youth Synod, you see Martini's voice in them. You see these allusions to young people as prophets. But that was how it was supposed to go. I think the people who are running the synod, including the vice president of the Martini Foundation, Giacomo Costa, who was one of the special secretaries.
SJ.
Yes, exactly. They tried to, again, I think they overplayed their hand in the Instrumentum Laboris because they used the ideological term LGBT. There was a lot of pushback against that. And Archbishop Chaput, he gave a really strong intervention at the opening of the Youth Synod, saying that LGBT does not belong in church documents. So you did have a lot of strong responses from people like Chaput, Cardinal Sarah, a lot of the African cardinals. But I think what that did was it made the revolution become more subterranean, more stealthy. There's been some good work done, especially by LifeSite News, about how they were trying to smuggle in the LGBT acronym. And one of the most potent moves that they made is they inserted this paragraph in the final document saying that basically the final document of the Youth Synod and the Instrumentum Laboris need to be read together. And that one statement, which unfortunately was approved by the necessary majority, that essentially baptizes the Instrumentum Laboris, which uses this controversial language, which opens up the question of what to propose to same-sex couples. So I think that the battle here is very real, and it's just become more kind of disguised, more content to go by that small step strategy.
Yeah, indeed, and we've obviously got the post-synodal exhortation coming out in a matter of weeks, I believe. So, yeah, we're not out of the woods yet. That could contain all sorts of surprises.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, do you want to say something on that?
I think that I just wanted to add that I think that no, I think I lost my train of thought. I apologize.
That's okay. That's fine. Pope Benedict the 16th said he started contemplating his abdication several months before he announced it, and that would put it right after Martini's death, and as some have said, Kasper's sort of ascension to the top of the St Gallen Mafia. Again, if you can see Martini's fingerprints over a lot of the methodology, the language, that even the theology that we're seeing, you can also see Kasper's fingerprints all over it. I think particularly when you write about in the Evangelii Gaudium, Pope Francis' vision of a sort of polyhedral church, which is a particularly kind of ambiguous term. But Cardinal Kasper wrote a lot on the theology and praxis of the bishop's office, and this is where he really clashed with then Cardinal Ratzinger. But I just quote here from the work Walter Kasper on the theology and praxis of the bishop's office. He quotes St John Paul II issuing a call for practical suggestions in his encyclical Et Unum Sint on how the Petrine ministry should be exercised. Such a dialogue, Kasper suggests, quote, would make sense only if it led to a new historical formation of the office of Peter. A new form would be similar to that which the office of Peter had in the first 1,000 years, but in a form appropriate to the differences in historical periods and the relationships of the various churches. End quote. So this appears to point to an exercise of the Petrine function, which is more participatory in style, involving the bishops of the world, so hence the synods. The Kasper does call on the kind of different transformations or different epochs of the Petrine office. And he says, one must indeed say that in the present form of its exercise, the Petrine ministry has far from completely exhausted its ecumenical possibilities. So, what's your current reading on Cardinal Kasper's influence in the Francis pontificate? You mentioned Martel's interview where Kasper says that his own attempts to change language in the family synod were stymied, and actually it was the more gradualist approach of Pope Francis, talking about individuals, emphasizing individual experience, that moved the lines, as he said.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you pointed to Kasper's fingerprints, so to speak, because Kasper's work gives us another important blueprint for the revolution. And I'm thinking specifically of a work he did on Martin Luther as an ecumenical figure. It's a very strange work, but essentially it valorizes Martin Luther and imagines this future state of the church where the church will, so to speak, be deconfessionalized, and it will overcome sort of those Catholic markers that seem to be accidents of history, that seem to not be conducive to ecumenical unity. And there was a really insightful article that Sandro Magister posted about a year ago by a professor on this very book. And the professor talks about how the revolution really is promoting this deconfessionalization. Because if you look at the family synods and communion for the divorced and remarried, that weakens indissoluble marriage, the Holy Eucharist. If you look at the way that Francis is exercising the Petrine ministry, this article talks about how that remark, "Who am I to judge?" just gives you a radical kind of reevaluation of who the Pope is and what his authority is. So I think that we're in very ominous territory, since Cardinal Kasper and Cardinal Martini are two of the great architects for this pontificate. And there's also some great work that I believe Thomas Stark did on Cardinal Kasper, talking about the modernist roots of Kasper's thought, and essentially the idea that Kasper seems to be very arrested by history, historicism, and this idea that God can't be, in his words, an enemy of the new. And this maps onto Martini's phrase that there are surprises from the Holy Spirit. And of course, that's where we get this idea from Pope Francis that we have a God of surprises that we are dealing with. And I think that, at the end of the day, this just goes back to modernism and the idea that the Church's dogmas can evolve, the idea that we've outgrown some of the different structures of the Church, some of the different rules, the morality, all of it goes back to modernism.
Yeah, I just want to read a little quote from Cardinal Kasper. He says, "We must resist this God, also for God's sake. He is not the true God at all, but rather a wretched idol. For a God who is not himself history is a finite God. If we call such a being God, then for the sake of the absolute we must become absolute atheists. Such a God springs from a rigid worldview. He is the guarantor of the status quo and the enemy of the new." So perhaps that was the quote to which you referred, but I can't think of a kind of better explication of the heresy of modernism in a nutshell, really.
Yeah, that's an extremely startling quotation. It's something that more people should be aware of. I think that I remember dealing with that quotation in an article about Kasper, and the article was called "Protestantism, Modernism, Atheism," and it really goes back to this idea that Pope St. Pius X had, that first you had Protestantism, and that led to modernism, and at the end of the day, you end up in atheism. And I think that this quotation from Cardinal Kasper, where you either have to have the God of surprises or you need to end up in atheism, it perfectly vindicates this quote, this prophetic insight that Pope St. Pius X had about where we would be headed if the modernists triumphed.
Absolutely. And sure enough, you have Cardinal Marx talking about the latest German bishop synod and appointing is it Archbishop Bode to examine specifically questions of sexuality, and I believe they will report in September. Do you kind of anticipate what do you anticipate coming out of that?
I anticipate more revolution. I anticipate that being a perfect illustration of that idea of permanent synodality being permanent revolution. Somewhere revolution is happening. It's happening in Germany. Definitely when Amoris Laetitia came out, you saw that principle in practice because some regions stayed faithful and other regions cried revolution. And altogether, the sum effect of that is to foment a kind of disobedience, a kind of rebellion. And I think that there was some insightful work that, again, Edward Penton had done on the German bishops and their relationship to this papacy. And he reported maybe last year that the German bishops were getting antsy, and they thought that the revolution wasn't happening fast enough. And so they were pressuring Francis to move forward on certain items. And I think that the fact that they are going forward with this synodal event is a very, very troubling sign of what's to come.
And you're seeing, growing resistance to this this revolutionary process from so-called conservative prelates, and to have cardinals publicly rebuking each other in the press is quite extraordinary, really. But it's the culmination, many would say, of the wider crisis the Church has been in ever since, or at least since the Second Vatican Council. I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Thomas Pink, Dr. Thomas Pink.
Not so much.
Okay, well, he did a very interesting interview with the National Catholic Register, and on the theology of baptism as the crisis in the Church being a crisis of the theology of baptism. And essentially, what he said is that there's a dichotomy, there's a dissonance between the magisterium, unchanging, immutable, and then the official theology, which is the theology that the Church has at any given moment in history to explain its magisterial teaching to the world and apply it to the world. And this gap can be quite small, or it can be quite large, depending on the Church's kind of prudential judgment about how to exercise its spiritual and indeed temporal power. And he says that the change that's happened in baptism is that the Church no longer believes that that an unconverted, unbaptized person is under the dominion of the devil. If we consider the teachings of the 19th century popes, will inevitably be in perpetual spiritual conflict with the Church, right? Because it's under the dominion of Satan. And this change has been accentuated by the change in the rite of baptism, where the old rite actually starts with an exorcism. Very explicitly, the child is actually saved from Satan and made obviously an adopted child of the Father. And this change has gradually come about, but has overtaken now pretty much the entire hierarchy, this theology, so that when the world, as Pius IX predicted it would in Quanta Cura, by separating itself from the Church, as like a body separating itself from its soul, it will die. And so the world will, the states will become more and more in the hands of the devil, because it's severed from the mediation of grace, sanctifying grace, and the gap between the Church's teaching and indeed the natural law, and then the world will grow ever more vast, and that's what we've seen. But because the theology has changed, and the Church looks to harmonize its relationship with the world and dialogue with the world, under the influence of people like Jacques Maritain, who said that the world has reached a level of accordance with the natural law, so that yes, unity of church and state was the right thing in medieval times, but now in modernity, the church needn't advocate that. And so what we have now is a situation where, as the world distances itself further and further from the gospel, the church is unable to admit that the problem is with the world in its unconverted state, and therefore sees the problem with itself, and constantly looks to itself and problems with its own language, with its own theology, with its own teaching, and must remove those obstacles in order to reharmonize its relationship with the secular world. And I think that's what these liberal modernists think. It comes down to a crisis in the sacraments, essentially.
Yeah, I think that's a really insightful context to the current crisis.
Yeah, I've done quite a poor job of explaining it, but I'll send you the article after this, and you can have a read.
Yeah, I think that relationship that you're talking about between the church and the world, and this kind of self-questioning, self-doubt that the church is going through right now. I think that definitely as we look at the historical issue of the St Gallen Mafia, it inevitably leads us further back to the crisis point of the Second Vatican Council and the spirit of Vatican II people that we had there. One person that it specifically leads us back to is Karl Rahner. And the historian Roberto de Mattei has actually said in a certain interview that Pope Francis's father is Martini, but his grandfather is Karl Rahner. And this sort of optimism that you have from Rahner about the world and trying to make the church the world, trying to dissolve these different aspects of the church. That was something that you see the imprint of that in Martini's thought, and the so-called open church that he wanted. Roberto de Mattei has talked very, very cogently about how essentially this open church, it wanted to open the doors of salvation to everyone, including if you don't observe Catholic morality, if you aren't a Catholic, just to essentially accept the world as it is. And that's something that you see in Martini, and definitely I would say the outgoing church of Pope Francis. It's just another version of the open church of Martini, and it is an accommodation with the world in a lot of senses.
Yeah. Well, Pink talks about Rahner and his idea of the anonymous Christian, that the merits of Christ's sacrifice have been given to all people in all time, and the church, the purpose of the church is merely a communal gathering for those who want to participate in a sign of that salvation that's already achieved. So the sacraments become a theatre of salvation. You know, they're just illustrating something that's already happened, right? So thought I'd relate that. Back to baptism, because I mean, you know, fundamentally, it's a different religion, isn't it? I mean, they don't have the same understanding of grace and salvation and the divine institution of the church that has been held by the church, you know, for her entire history.
Yeah. I think that again, more very insightful points about how the very foundations of the modernists and the rest of the church are diametrically opposed. And I think that there was a really great article that LifeSite News did with an interview with Claudio Pierantoni. I believe that's how you pronounce his name. And he basically said that Amoris Laetitia and this idea of communion for the divorced and remarried, it seemed like that was the sole issue that it was dealing with, but the premises that they needed to invoke to get to that point, it exposed that their overall paradigm is a modernist paradigm. Mm-hmm. And definitely if you start with this modernist idea that God somehow identifies himself with creation, and so the magisterium doesn't have to be logically coherent with the magisterium of the past. You get this, he compared it, I think, to kind of a form of insanity where logic doesn't hold anymore, where there can be contradictions because of this idea that there's this evolution that is happening.
Yeah, absolutely. I would like to just quickly get your thoughts on the most explosive matter in the church over the last 2 years, which has been the homosexual. Has been the sexual. That was a Freudian slip. A sexual abuse scandal, and the fall of McCarrick, who was a member of the St Gallen Mafia. Is that right?
I'm not sure. Most people don't count him as an actual member, but definitely it's understood that he, according to his own testimony, collaborated with them insofar as he talked to Bergoglio about becoming Pope.
And I don't know if you've heard the testimony of James Grine, who was one of the abuse victims, but he mentions how McCarrick would go to St Gallen many years before the meetings actually began, and I believe that the journalist Dr. Taylor Marshall is writing a book that puts these pieces together, so that should be very interesting. But in a sense, the cat's sort of out the bag now, because you have even mainstream reporters like CNN asking Cardinal Kupich about the connection between homosexuality in the priesthood and the ongoing the uncovering of abuse within the church, and consciousness amongst the laity about this development, the prevalence of abuse of adolescent boys in particular is growing all the time. So how do you see the methodology for dealing with the abuse scandals evolving or carrying on?
I think that, again, if we look at what Martini has said about the sexual abuse crisis before he died, he said that the church needed to change its teaching on sexuality, and that was basically causing the issues with sexual abuse. And we see similar lines from the German bishops that basically the church is what has to change, and things like celibacy have to change. I think that definitely it's been very audacious that when you have this crisis of overwhelmingly homosexual predation on the young, both minors and adults, the fact that the different synods and different revolutionaries would continue to push the revolution on homosexuality at the very same moment. It shows this incredible audacity, but it's the same line that the world accepts, which is that the church needs to revolutionize its teachings. The problem is with the church, and somehow a sexual abuse crisis can be exploited to create a revolution.
Yeah, and it's interesting or sobering to think that this crisis, I mean, people were talking about the homosexual nature of abuse years ago. I'm thinking of Randy Engel and one or two others, but it nevertheless wasn't widely known. But it's emerged at precisely the time that dealing with it, as in really purging predatory priests, would bring down the fury of the secular world. Whereas if this had emerged, say, I don't know, 10, 20 years ago, before this exaltation of homosexuality across the modern world, then the church might have been able to actually clamp down on it without provoking that kind of reaction. Whereas now the church is is essentially almost, I mean, she can and should obviously do something about it, but I'm sure that for a lot of clerics that's a consideration, that it would the optics would look so bad in the world that's kind of turned rainbow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. I think that the fact that I think more needs to be made of the fact that McCarrick, he was not just doing these horrible abuses privately. He was also promoting different forms of revolution and subversion in public. I think it's important that he, shortly after Pope Francis became Pope, McCarrick talked about how he didn't have a problem with same-sex civil unions, and he garnered favor by accommodating himself to the world completely, and that was something I think that protected him for a long time. We have different stories about people knowing about him and potentially killing stories because it would be a bad narrative to look at someone who was practicing this kind of sexual predation.
But I'd like to just ask one final question, and that's regarding another track of the current Vatican agenda, which is fixation on climate change and cooperation with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And this is marvellously explained in your article, Population Control Advocates Hobnob at the Vatican. And yeah, you talk about the rampant kind of ambiguity and heterodoxy that takes place at these gatherings. For example, Bishop Marcello Sanchez Sorondo said that we don't know exactly what is the doctrine of the church about fecundity, only some part of it. So it's part of this constant sort of fragmenting and blurring of magisterial teaching. What do you see are recent developments in the supposed alignment between the church's authorities and the anti-life agenda of the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because it's an extremely ominous issue that we need to continually bring back to mind. That population control issue that happened in previous years, that conference, one of the attendees was John Bongartz from I believe the Population Council. And I listened to his speech that he gave where he basically touted contraception as something that is useful, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, in his idea. John Bongartz, he basically gave another version of that talk in a paper that he did that I forget which year he did it, but he wanted universal access to contraception in 10 years. And of course, the UN agenda with the Sustainable Development Goals, it's for the year 2030. And people like Jeffrey Sachs, who has promoted abortion before, are coming to the Vatican. And I've listened to some of these talks where you have Sachs talking to young people saying they have 10 years or 13 years or whatever to end poverty and get the goals developed. So this is something, again, where we see in our mind kind of a long stretch of about a little over a decade left to implement those goals. And recently I did some more research on Cardinal Parolin, who is often touted as the likely successor to Pope Francis. And he helped present a book that was entitled The Birth of an Encyclical, and it was looking back at Humanae Vitae in light of the Vatican archives. And this book essentially gives a pastoral slant to Humanae Vitae, in the same way that we were discussing before, where the doctrine can remain untouched, but in practice we have to be compassionate with everyone who dissents from it. And Parolin, in his own remarks, really emphasized this sort of pastoral aspect to Humanae Vitae. And so I think that definitely there is an agenda to subvert Humanae Vitae and thereby get the church on board with the Sustainable Development Goals, which do, as pro-life leaders have warned, have language that is really coded language for universal access to contraception and abortion.
Yeah. And then obviously once you've separated the unitive and procreative aspects of the conjugal act, everything else from the sexual revolution just follows sure as day after that. I don't know if you've heard of the philosopher Augusto Del Noce, Italian. No. He said, after the negation of transcendence, politics itself becomes the transcendental horizon, and ethics, like truth, is subsumed under the form of war. So he would call our society a totalitarian one, because his definition of a totalitarian society is where culture, which would include ethics in his definition, is subordinated to politics. And this sort of fixation by the Vatican on sort of worldly issues, not that there isn't a preferential option for the poor or anything else like that, but this fixation to the exclusion of theology and philosophy, this employment of economics, of psychology, of science, to the negation of her own native tongues of philosophy and theology, metaphysics. It's kind of bespeaks a church that has lost confidence in its own mission.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a great point, and that quotation is very, very thought-provoking. It reminds me of something that Venerable Fulton Sheen once said, and he said that theology becomes politics for many people, and he likened it to the third temptation of Christ, where Satan showed him all the kingdoms of the world. And he actually, in one of his talks, he said that this would be the great temptation for the church coming up, that it would be tempted exactly as Christ was tempted. And I see that most conspicuously in this 2030 agenda.
Yeah. Pater Edmund Waldstein of the Josias website and podcast, Cistercian, has got a very interesting kind of esoteric integralist theory, and to draw from Pope Leo XIII's hylomorphic analogy in Immortali Dei about the church corresponding to the soul and the state to the body. Pater Waldstein describes how the church separated from the state is analogous to the separation of body and soul, which equals death. But we learn in Catholic theology that after the particular judgment and before the resurrection of the dead, our souls, though they're in purgatory or the beatific vision, still long for our body. And so he says that analogically, the church, separated from the state, is still longing for its body. So the body's corrupt, it's just rotting, and that's what's happening to the secular world. But the church is longing for its corporeality, its actual its temporal presence, and so that's why she constantly just talks about money and economics and science, and as I said, all these secondary concerns, because she no longer has the union with the state, with her body, to actually affect sanctification of the temporal sphere.
Yeah, that's a really, really interesting insight.
Yeah.
The longing for the body. I like that very much.
I'm interested though how you actually got into doing your own independent research on developments in the church. Was that just
I got into it because I had originally sort of I had been a fan of Pope Francis and had read a lot of very, very laudatory things about him, and I wasn't really following the church very closely. And he began to say increasingly disturbing things, and there was one point where he said that many marriages are potentially invalid, and it really disturbed me, and I felt that I needed to say something about it. And so I submitted an anonymous article to Crisis because I was kind of afraid of sticking my neck out, and it just turned out that then I started writing, under my full name, and kind of as a writer I've learned to try to not be afraid to say things that may be uncomfortable. I try to tell it like I see it.
Amen. I think for me, my Francis moment was one of them was when he said Emma Bonino, the Italian abortion activist, an actual abortionist, I believe as well, was one of Italy's forgotten greats. I found that just so depressing and demoralizing. And it's a kind of wake up call. But I do agree with what Hilary White says. Is it Hilary White? Yeah, she says that the remnant, that Pope Francis is a blessing from God, and I think that's the case because he is waking up so many Catholics, particularly sort of conservative Catholics, to the larger crisis in the church. And indeed, she says the church could not have survived another conservative papacy, because that conservatism maintains the illusion that tradition and novelty can be contained in the same vessel, whereas in fact they're antithetical. This truce post-Vatican II, that the church keeps the same teachings but doesn't actually teach them, is impossible to maintain, and is of course breaking apart right now. And ultimately that's a grace from God, and it may well be, as that famous Ratzinger interview says, that we're heading towards like a smaller, holier church. But that's what the world needs. I think that's what our souls need.
Yeah, I definitely agree, and I think that I was listening to I was watching one of the YouTube videos of Dr. Taylor Marshall recently.
Oh, right.
And the Dr. Marshall and Timothy Gordon, and they were talking about certain issues in prior pontificates, such as the Assisi meeting, and this sort of territory. There was a time when it was not really safe to talk about things like that, not really safe to criticize very much if you're in the conservative camp. And now we can have genuine discussions where we can identify what has been positive in previous pontificates and identify what the problematic aspects are, so that we can actually be purified, as you've explained.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. Henry Sear, who wrote The Dictator Pope, I don't know if you read his previous book, Phoenix from the Ashes.
Part of it, I've read parts.
That's a very good book. If I want to give a one book summary to inform a Catholic, that's usually what I recommend, because and particularly the last chapter about the restoration of tradition, where he identifies I think 4 or 5 phases. The first is Paul is the kind of attempt to eradicate tradition, and that was sort of the 70s, Paul VI. Then there's the second phase, which is this sort of hermeneutic of continuity, this, as I say, this attempt to contain tradition and novelty together and say that they're perfectly harmonious. And then the third is what we're in now, which is open open criticism of the spirit of Vatican II developments, etc. And also the strengthening, the what is it called, the coalescence of tradition, which obviously started with motu proprio, with the Summorum Pontificum. So it's like there's green shoots kind of, if you look closely. All right, well, thank you very much, Julia. I always really look forward to reading your articles. I know they're going to be particularly interesting and insightful and entertaining as well. So thank you for that.
Thank you, and thank you so much for having me. I thought this was it was really fun for me to converse with you, and you obviously, you follow things with the church and the church's history and tradition really closely. So it was really a pleasure to get to talk out some of these things with you.
Thank you. Likewise, Julian. All right. God bless.
Thank you. God bless.
Goodbye. Bye.